In 1973, Theodosius Dobzhansky said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Actually, that was the title of a paper he wrote for a journal written for biology teachers, and it became a famous quote in the biology world. He also wrote in his essay that the diversity and unity of life are equally striking and meaningful aspects of the living world. And then he went on to discuss what biologists were all talking about in the 1970s. They were talking about the extraordinary size of the hoof and mouth virus, the DNA instructions housed in every cell and virus, and a debate going on over what is living and what's just a chemical. Well, let's talk about that debate. Viruses still exist in some sort of gray area between living and non-living, and Googling characteristics of living things won't produce one perfect list to memorize. We're going to use this list. The living things are made of cells, they reproduce using DNA, they use energy for metabolism, they grow and develop, they respond to stimuli, and they adapt to their environment. Living things also require a maintenance of homeostasis, and homeostasis is a stable internal condition. And many of the characteristics of living things allow that maintenance of homeostasis. So, for example, anytime your cells need energy, they're going to take glucose out of your bloodstream and burn that energy in the glucose for different proteins and things that use a form of chemical energy from the glucose. Well, how do you then raise your blood sugar back up to normal levels? Well, that's done with two enzymes, and they're called insulin, which you've probably heard of. It's related to diabetes, and glucagon. And they work together to bring the blood sugar levels up and down. So just to use this diagram, so if your blood sugar is high, then insulin is released to signal that glucose intake into the cells, pulling it out of the bloodstream. Or, conversely, if your blood sugar is low, then glucagon is released. And so in your liver especially, but glycogen is actually also found in your muscle cells, but that glycogen will turn into glucose and raise your blood sugar. So glycogen is just it's a large complex carbohydrate, and it can be broken down into smaller glucose molecules. At various times in our lives, we're going to go through varying amounts of growth, which are changes in size, and development. And development's a little bit harder to define. Just to list a few things, you can think of that as things you learn, any kind of hormonal changes. These are really all the changes going on in your body on a daily, monthly, yearly time scale that don't necessarily involve growth. So developing language, any kind of brain connections and changes there, those all fall under development. Another of those traits off the list to stay alive, you really need to be able to respond to stimuli. Failing to respond to stimuli is a really good way to, well, get yourself dead. If you touch something hot, you are going to instinctively jerk away. If you were to see a predator, you should hopefully run away. And there's a series of cause and effect type responses to stimuli always going on, and one that many of you are probably familiar with is attraction. And so just as a reminder, that response to stimuli can be one cause to a single effect, or often in the case of like attraction, it could be one cause and many effects. And so there's a series of responses going on. When you see someone you're crushing on, your pulse rate is going to go up, your eyes will dilate, you might get sweaty palms, and those are all the result of brain chemicals. Specifically, it's mostly norepinephrine and dopamine. And so a lot of these behaviors that we might think of as really quirky or just complicated. They're really a complicated collection of responses to a stimulus. The term adaptation is always something I'd like to clear up early on in biology class. The word has a lot of meanings in the English language, and it has two meanings even in biology. So this is a great example of how biology is a very language-rich science, and you're going to see that coming up over and over and over again. So just embrace it now. But the first meaning, the one we're going to talk about here, the plastic adaptation, is a change that better helps the organism cope with its environment without any kind of permanent change to the DNA. Because remember, we use DNA to reproduce, so those changes would all be passed on to our offspring. So these are sometimes called plastic adaptations, and this is anything as simple as a suntan, acclimating to cold temperatures, or in this example, acclimating to a higher elevation. So at normal elevation, you're going to have a certain level of fitness, and if you go into a high elevation, your fitness level is going to drop, and then as you acclimate, it should start to increase again. And so what's going on here? Well, in that high elevation, you have a lower oxygen environment. So you're going to have to increase the number of red blood cells that you have in your bloodstream. You'll actually have to have a higher concentration of them, and the number of capillaries branching off to feed that oxygen to your cells, you'll have to grow new capillaries as well, and so that takes time, and that's why you see this slow process of acclimatization, but it takes some time. It doesn't happen right away. It's good that this happens, because if it didn't, everyone living in a high elevation would have a faster heart rate and just various other things that wouldn't make them equally likely to live a long, healthy human lifespan. So I think that's pretty cool. The other way we look at adaptations in biology is in the sense of evolutionary adaptations. And so your DNA is the code for various traits, and if those traits are beneficial, then you can pass those on to your offspring. And so these are the kind of adaptations that we normally talk about in biology, but when I'm thinking of what helps to keep us alive, those plastic adaptations also seem to be very important. And so we'll talk a lot more about evolutionary adaptation. So just to recap, living things have cells. They reproduce, they consume energy, they grow and develop, they respond to stimuli, and they adapt in all kinds of various ways. So when you stop and think about all of the many branches of life, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, protists, this list really starts to make sense. And so in the next video segment, you will learn a lot more about the diversity of life that's out there.